I'm Sheila Guillotone, and this is the Simsbury Woman. Today we are going to explore an issue about which many people may feel uncomfortable: hospice care. The term hospice comes from the same linguistic root as hospitality. The word can be traced back to medieval times when it referred to a place of shelter and rest for a weary or ill traveler on a long journey. But we're going to explore not the hospice experience itself, but rather a very specific topic within the issue. Our guest today, Paula Bruns, wants to inform our viewers about a program that enlists and trains people to be volunteers. She's been involved with training hospice volunteers for 12 years now, and is also involved with the training programs and the support they give the volunteers. Many will instinctively shy away from this concept. Paula will discuss why fear should not stop anyone from volunteering. There is a great need for volunteers, and there is also some very sophisticated training programs for those who wish to volunteer. We all know anything is easier to do if you're comfortable knowing how to do it properly. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Before we get to the actual volunteer subject, could you tell us a little bit about how you got into this hospice and this particular volunteer program?
Sure. I was a special education teacher for many years, and after having children and trying to find something where I could use my skills in the community for the betterment of the community, I had done a lot of volunteer work. While I was in college, I actually took a course in death and dying, and I was really fascinated with it. I read a lot of the authors. I'm sure people are familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So I was so interested in it, and I was actually looking for a volunteer opportunity when I saw an ad for a volunteer coordinator for hospice. So I thought, well, I'm going to apply. Got the job, took the training myself, did some hospice volunteering, as well as training hospice volunteers. And eventually that led to a career within hospice with sales and marketing. So
interesting.
Evolution.
Well, before we talk about the volunteer program, which we would like to spend most of our time on, could you give us a brief history of hospice? We know where the word came from. We know it began in Britain with a physician there. And I think we also know that the first one in the U.S. was started in Connecticut at Yale. So just give us a little idea about what hospice is, because I don't think most people exactly know. I know I don't.
Okay. Well, I think if we look at hospice as a philosophy of care, it's a care very specific to people with life-limiting diseases. Perhaps there is no cure for their disease, or a cure is no longer desirable or attainable. So hospice actually started as a grassroots movement. And the way it started was because people who were in that situation at end of life needed support. They needed help with, obviously, being comfortable, alleviating suffering, putting other people in place who could help, because there's a lot of suffering that goes on that's both spiritual at end of life. There's emotional needs. There's emotional needs for the whole family. So hospice really it's a philosophy of care that looks not just at the patient, but the entire family as the unit of care.
It's interesting because you're going to have to give us the broader idea, because in my ignorance, when I think of hospice, I think of, that part of a hospital where, people who are dying go. And I didn't realize until I started looking over, some of the materials you had supplied that, oh, wait a minute, hospice care can be anywhere.
Yes. It's not a place. Hospice,
it's not a place. I thought it was a place.
Right, and there are places, but hospice care is available to anybody wherever they call home. So it could be in your private home, it could be in an assisted living facility, a nursing home, sometimes in the hospital, but in those cases it's really for somebody in just their final days of life. And hospice is more about the final phase of life, which is more like 6 months. So it's wherever they call home. People in prison have hospice.
Really?
Hospice agencies bring the team to wherever that patient is. So it's a broad notion. It is also a Medicare benefit. So it's something people can opt into.
Yes, I was reading. In fact, one of the things I looked at was, according to the statistics, 1.43 million Medicare beneficiaries were enrolled in hospice care for a minimum of at least one day in these statistics were from 2016. And Medicare affords patients, they talk about 4 levels of care to meet their clinical needs. And I'm sure you know what they are, but
yes.
I wrote them down. So
right,
tell
right.
us a little
well,
about that.
I think the thing that I'd like to say right there is the fact that it saddens me. If anything about hospice saddens me, it's that people go on to hospice for one day. Because hospice has so much to offer for the mind, body, and spirit. And when you only have an opportunity to be in with that family and that patient for a day, I'm not sure they get to experience any of the real values that hospice has to offer.
Now, you talked about a team, even when you were talking about the prison. What's the team approach? Who's on a team?
So this is all Medicare mandated too. So this is
They haven't cut that out yet.
No, and I don't think they're going to, and I'll tell you why in a minute.
Yeah.
So the hospice team, upon the referral of a physician, will come in. So that's a hospice nurse. Who they deal with all of the physical issues going on. Oftentimes there's pain, there's discomfort, there's multiple other things going on. So they get all of the symptoms under control. There is a social worker. There are a lot of needs near end of life that start with funeral planning. How many people, don't think about that ahead of time? Well, the social worker is going to talk to the family and say, what funeral home? Because we're all on the same page at that point. We've had the conversation that we understand this patient
is
dying, and so let's put all the pieces into place. Social workers can also help if the families need to access additional care. So just helping the whole social situation of the family and the patient. We bring in spiritual and bereavement specialists. Many times there's a lot of spiritual distress at end of life. Things that I did do or didn't do.
With the patient?
Well, for the patient,
and
of course,
the family?
and for the family. People try and fix things a little bit. Obviously, the home health aides who come in and help with the personal care of the patient. And then, of course, what we're here today to talk about are our glorious volunteers who add tremendous value.
Okay, most people, when you start talking about hospice, get a little squirrely. Before we talk about volunteering, can you clear up some of the notions that it's kind of a depressing thing to get involved with?
Right. I can see that, and I think a lot of the myths exist because of what we just talked about before. A lot of people, the hospice decision is put off until the end. So what I will frequently hear from people is, well, I'm not putting my mother on hospice because my neighbor's mother went on hospice and 3 days later she was dead. They killed her. And of course, well,
that's kind of a jump, but
it is because people think, oh, you go on hospice and you die.
And you die.
And so that actually isn't the case. Oftentimes it's because people have waited so long because of their discomfort or because they don't understand. A lot of people think that hospice nurses come in and use a lot of medication and help the patients to
along.
And first of all, these nurses all have licenses that they need to protect.
Sure.
The nurses that decide to become hospice nurses are operating under the direction of a doctor. They're operating within a team, a multidisciplinary team. Nobody is over-medicating patients to hasten the death. I mean, it's hospice neither prolongs life, so we're not actively seeking treatment for the disease anymore, but we're not doing anything to hasten death.
Right, but unlike some of the silly things you hear about, well, you know, we can't give that person a drug because they might get addicted, seems kind of, wait a minute, they're
right.
stop, you know,
yes, and again,
but you will
that's
do
the
what is necessary to keep people comfortable.
Right, and that's an interdisciplinary decision between physicians and nurses, and hospice is a specialized form of care. Like, we go to specialists for different diseases.
Sure.
When I have a problem with my foot, I go to a foot doctor,
Right.
etc. So hospice care is very specialized to end of life, and the needs.
Are there doctors who specialize in that?
There are some doctors that, for Constellation's hospice physician is a
Okay.
physician who's had vast experience with geriatrics.
Okay.
And
Geriatrics,
right.
of course, yeah.
So it's when you think about hospice, a lot of times here's one of my favorite, and this happened a lot. Okay,
Yeah.
I'd be talking to the adult child of a potential hospice patient, and they'd be like, you can't tell my mom she needs to go on hospice because, you know, she's going to give up hope, and she's going to, you know, you can't tell her she's dying. And then you talk to the mother, and the mother
she
goes,
goes, "I
you
know."
can't tell my kids I'm dying. And so it's kind of the bringing together of the conversation.
Okay.
So that's, I mean, a lot of people just say, I can't bring up hospice because I'm giving up hope. And it's not.
There is that stigma.
Well, here's my saying.
Okay.
And it's probably, I didn't originate it, but I'll tell you, it's not giving up hope, but it's changing what you hope for.
Okay.
And when time is limited, we have choices about how we're going to spend that time. And for some people, spending that time going back and forth to the emergency room is important to them.
Okay.
Okay? For some people, spending time at home looking out the window at their flower garden
Yeah.
is important to them. That's the kind of person that would choose the hospice benefit.
Okay.
The person who likes to go back and forth to the hospital all the time.
Now, you did tell me something on the phone that sort of really confused me, because you said a great many people in hospice are actually Alzheimer's or dementia patients.
Right.
That never occurred to me.
Well, people who, you know, because it's a Medicare benefit, there's certain qualifications to become a recipient of hospice services. So in many of the diseases we look at, you know, we all associate cancer.
Cancer, yeah.
Okay, and that's really how
Or stroke or heart attack, right.
So the cancer is really where I think hospice began being an important part of healthcare. So then we have heart, lung, Lou Gehrig's, I can't remember the name of
ALS.
that. ALS. But dementia, which, as you know, is just fast growing and huge amount of people diagnosed with it. So we're not talking about the person who's still up and walking around and functioning. We're looking at a person who's at the end stage with dementia.
Okay.
And if we look at somebody who's no longer able to swallow, communicate, they have a very specific set of needs at end of life that are very different than somebody who's experiencing a huge amount of pain. But their needs are still great.
Okay.
And hospice comes up alongside them and walks with the family.
Wow. All right. That, again, you know, I have a very parochial attitude towards, I actually only had one family experience. It was my 87-year-old aunt who lived by herself, had a stroke, got to the point where they didn't think they could do anything. We were going to bring her home. And then she went into a coma, and she went to Hospice McLean here in Simsbury, and she was essentially in a coma, and she was there for a week, and you know, she did die. But I have to say, I was so impressed with the nurses who got, you know, the whole family and explained everything that was going on and what they were doing. And I mean, ours was a relatively short and easy because she wasn't even awake. Right. But that was my only personal.
I think with the dementia patient, they tend to be on hospice a little bit longer. We know there is no cure for dementia. We know, you know, there sadly there isn't. And so when people get to the end stage with that, so we're talking about people who have been through a series of losses in their lives already, loss of independence, ability to walk, ability to toilet themselves, and probably in a state where they're being fed, maybe having some swallowing difficulties. So maybe they can talk a little bit. Maybe they're not talking anymore. And for those patients, I mean, the hospice team really embraces the family and the patient in what is probably the end of a very, very long illness.
Yeah. We were fortunate. She went very good. You know, she lived by herself until she was 87, and then it was like 2 weeks, and that was it. But I was impressed with the hospice nurses. They were just the kindest, most considerate group I'd ever met. Let's talk about volunteering, because that's exactly why we're here.
Sure.
What exactly is a hospice volunteer?
Well, a hospice volunteer is required by Medicare. Medicare actually requires that we place hospice volunteers with our patients. They even give us a certain percentage of hours. So we look at the total number of patient care hours, 5% of those have to come from volunteers. Believe
Medicare
that?
sets that up?
Medicare. And you know, here's why though. Because if you remember what we said before, is hospice was a real grassroots movement. Not until the 70s was hospice paid for by Medicare and many private insurances as well. So it's consistent with the grassroots movement, isn't it? It kind of keeps that string going there.
Absolutely.
And a recognition that this is a mind, body, spirit kind of care. And we have nurses who do what they do. We have the social workers, we have the bereavement, we have the spiritual. We have all of those people together. And the volunteers are the extra layer. They're the extra layer of spending time with the person.
Okay.
And that's
So, if I'm a hospice volunteer, what exactly would I be doing? And I realize it would be different patient to patient.
Different patient.
But what
to
kinds
patient.
of things?
Oh, I can tell stories.
Okay, tell stories.
So,
That's always
hospice,
good.
first and foremost, hospice volunteers never do any patient care that they're not allowed to, because they're not trained to do it.
Right.
So you're a visitor, you're a friendly visitor coming in, and before you go to see the patient, the staff with Constellation will have spoken to you about the patient's life. You don't want to just walk in and see somebody laying in a bed and not know who they were. So we give a lot of examples. This person was a nurse, this person loved dogs, this person, whatever. We give them the background. And a hospice volunteer goes in and just visits. And sometimes that visit looks different depending on the patient. So
this visit could take place any place. It could be in a hospital, it could be in their home, it could be in any of the
nursing
places
home
that you mentioned.
Exactly. Now, remember when we talked before about, say, a dementia patient, I'm going to use that as an example. This is a long disease process. Oftentimes these folks are old. They've lost friends, siblings, spouses. So there's a lot of people at end of life in nursing homes and hospitals and assisted living who don't have visitors. It's a very isolating disease. So to have somebody, a hospice volunteer, come in just to spend time with them, just to hang out. It could be to listen to music. Sometimes a non-communicative, non-verbal patient, upon hearing music from their era, will start to tap their toe. It could be reading to them. It could be, if they're in a wheelchair, taking them outside. I one time had a volunteer just move to tears because she took a patient outdoors. There were some walking trails, and he was fascinated with seeing rocks. And you think about it, he's inside all day. He was outside. He could hear the birds. He could kind of hang out, just be. Sometimes accompanying them to a program, or watching a television program together. Or I had one volunteer who read recipes to an old Italian lady.
Really?
And that was how they communicated. Volunteers can write letters. Volunteers, with permission from the family, can allow the patient to have some FaceTime on the phone.
Sure.
So they can see a loved one. Families are, quite disjointed. They can also help families. Sometimes families need somebody to talk to, just a listening ear, not going to solve anything, but just to listen, just to, or give the family a break. They say they have a wedding to go to over a weekend and they feel badly that nobody's going to visit. The volunteer can go in and visit.
Okay.
We have volunteers who can choose to become a very specialized sort of volunteer who stays with the patient in the final hours.
Oh.
And you say, oh, some people actually, I have to tell you, I just spoke with our volunteer of the year, and I asked her what her most moving moment was, and she said it was being with a patient when they took their last breath. Because
Really?
she said, if I hadn't been there, nobody else would have been there. And she said, I held her hand, I know I soothed her, I saw her relax, and even though I loved the time I had with her, I was glad that she had moved on to the next place and that I could be there.
Wow.
Now, not every volunteer will have that experience.
Yeah.
Some volunteers visit with their specially trained therapy dog.
Oh, yes.
So, or cat, or one time I heard about a bunny.
Bunnies are cute.
Right, exactly.
Sure.
So
Yeah, something
that
soft you can pet.
changes up the atmosphere.
Okay.
We do a lot, we encourage a lot with our hospice volunteers, something that the big term is life review. And it's giving a patient an opportunity, and the family too, to talk about the patient's life and to celebrate who they were and what special talent they had or what special memories they had. I had a little lady who was very, 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 it was important to her that everybody knew that she had this, I guess, long history of being a seamstress.
Oh.
And she loved to talk about who she saw, who, you know, fabrics she worked with, things she made for her kids, and the family provided us with pictures. We train our hospice volunteers to kind of be detectives, look around the room. What do you see? Do you see a crucifix on the wall? Safe guess, the person might want to pray.
Right.
You see pictures of children. They might not be able to tell you who the children are, but you can certainly bring their attention to it.
Okay. The first question I'm sure you get whenever anyone talks about this is, isn't it really sad?
Yeah, that is the first question. In fact, what hospice volunteers often say is it okay if I cry?
Oh.
And I say, well, yeah, it's okay if you cry, but it's okay if you laugh too, and you're probably going to laugh more. It can be sad thinking about somebody who's isolated or suffering, or for me, a lot of times I get most emotional after I talk with a family because, you know, you can't help but think about your own family and things that might, you know, things that will happen at some point. So yes, there are tears, but it's very infrequent. There's volunteers will often say, I'm not sure if I'm really doing anything for the patient, but man, I feel so good when I come out of there.
Really?
I say, well, that's contagious. The patient's going to feel that.
Interesting.
So more likely, you're going to, as a hospice volunteer, hear good things and comforting things.
Oh, that's yeah, as I said, you know, my daughter's a therapist, and there's another woman in her complex who is an end-of-life therapist, and she always tells her, oh, I have all these extra patients if you ever want to pick up some extra hours, because of course she's know, certified then. Deirdre's like, no.
Well, you know, it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
And I think that's, for people thinking about doing this, there's plenty of volunteer opportunities out there. This is a volunteer opportunity where you're really making a significant impact on one person. And a significant impact on yourself as well, because you always, for me, I always learn something walking away from a situation where somebody knows they're at their end of their life. They're willing to accept somebody new coming into their life. They're much more open. People at end of life tend to be much more open to that.
Let's talk a little bit about the training, because I know you're very involved in that.
Yes.
What is involved in the training? Because it seems to be you've got very specialized programs. So how does the training work?
Well, the first thing is to get in touch with us and have a conversation about where you are and on your path and what you see yourself doing. The training is it's not the best part, because being the volunteer is the best part. The training actually brings you through the whole hospice, sort of the history that we talked about, how each team member functions, what your role on the team is. We have a great opportunity through a company called Teaching Transitions. We train our hospice volunteers first online. So on your
Oh,
own time, which is
okay.
great, because the first thing I always think is I don't have time to volunteer.
Yeah.
So you can do this, with a cup of coffee in the morning, 11 o'clock at night, after
Yeah.
your kids are in bed, whatever. So it brings you through the training modules that at the end of taking all of those training modules, you become a certified end-of-life specialist.
Oh.
And it's a designation that is important, because not only in your work as a hospice volunteer, but in your work as a human being, you come across people either who are recently have recently had a loss in their family. So part of this training teaches you, how do you deal with somebody who's grieving?
Yeah. It's very hard.
What do you say, and more importantly, what don't you say?
Well, yeah.
I mean, that's critical. What grieving looks like, what the process looks like, how we help people through that process, what benchmarks are we looking for to say that, geez, this person isn't doing so well, because there's ways people go through griefs that are so different from one another. And some of our volunteers are bereavement volunteers. They go on to work with families after the patient dies.
And there's training for that as well.
That's all included in this training, and then
Oh.
there's some specialized time they can spend with our bereavement people
Oh.
to learn a little bit more.
There was one thing I did notice in one of the sites that I looked at, and it kind of threw me for a loop. There actually are children who are
On hospice?
on hospice?
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
dear.
We don't see it very often.
Okay.
Because I think the whole way we approach a child with a life-limiting illness
Yeah.
is probably more treat.
Okay.
In the 12 years that I've been involved, I've seen one
Okay.
child on hospice.
Okay.
I think that would probably not be something a
Okay.
hospice volunteer would encounter.
Would run into. That's
I-
probably a good thing.
Yeah, it's more, I mean, there are some difficult
Yeah.
cases, and I'll tell you,
Sure.
when it's somebody my age, somebody younger, it's difficult.
Yeah.
Hospice volunteers always have the opportunity to say, I can't handle that,
Okay.
or I can handle this. And
Okay.
and a lot of them start out saying, I can't handle it, and wind up being able
One
to
of the
handle
things
it.
you mentioned before we finish, and I want you to be able to tell people, you mentioned you had an area very close to us where you are desperately in need of volunteers.
Yes. In the Hartford, and just the greater Hartford area, both in private homes and in facilities, but the Hebrew home, where we see patients for hospice, we have a great need in that area, but throughout
Okay.
Connecticut, but specifically for the purposes of our conversation, the greater Hartford area. A lot of people don't realize that once this training is completed, you sort of you self-determine your schedule.
Okay.
We tell you what the patient needs, and in the cases of a patient being in a nursing home or a hospital or even a private home, you can set your schedule.
Okay, well, as usual, our time is up.
I can't believe it.
It is. I want to thank Paula for her insights and encourage any of you who have an interest in following up. Try and get in touch with Catherine Lloyd, the lead volunteer service coordinator. We've included her contact information at the end of this program. I hope that many of our viewers will find that they do have an interest in volunteering, and that Paula has made you less fearful about hospice volunteering. Thank you for watching, and I wish all of you a happy and healthy day.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.